Hello class, today we're going to be starting chapters 6 and 7. So we have two sets of introductory questions today. The first one, define autotroph, provide an example of an autotroph. You probably already know what that is. Number 2, write the photosynthesis equation. Number 3, describe in words the photosynthesis equation. Number 4, explain how scientists discovered the process of photosynthesis. And then we're also going to go into the light reaction today. So describe pigments of light, provide some examples of pigments that autotrophs use for photosynthesis. Number 2, explain why trees have green leaves that change color in the fall. What happens to the pigments in the leaves? Number 3, be able to distinguish between the parts of a chloroplast. Number 4, what are the reactants and products of the light reaction and where does the light reaction take place? And number 5, define chemiosmosis. All right, so starting into these notes today, you can use your notes packet if you choose. And if you are doing that, I'll try and go through and kind of remind you where things fit on the notes packet. So to start with here, photosynthesis is just capturing energy, and it's plants being able to capture this energy and turn it into usable food for itself, but also for other organisms that happen to eat these plants. So first, just kind of a description of energy here. Autotrophs, and this is on the top right of your notes packet if you are writing there, they are organisms that make their own food from inorganic substances and energy. Now this inorganic substances here is light. If by chance they were chemosynthesizers, then it could be chemicals. So since we're not clarifying that right now, we just are talking about autotrophs, then it could be light or chemicals. Auto means self, so they are doing this themselves. We think about automatic or Autobot or something like that. It's doing it itself. So inorganic substances are either light or chemicals. Photosynthesis is dealing with light. So we're taking light energy and turning it into chemical energy, which can be described as ATP, or possibly sugar. So in autotrophs, they are storing their chemical energy as organic compounds. Carbohydrates is an example, or sugar. You'll be able to see this in the little activity, the online activity that you're going to do with the beginning here of photosynthesis. So some examples of things that do, that are autotrophs are plants, algae, and then some bacteria. You'll notice on your sheet that you have the equation. If by chance you are using the notes packet, you have the equation already on your notes packet. What we're going to do is describe what these are. So CO2, hopefully you've seen that before. That is carbon dioxide plus H2O, which is water, plus light, produces, that's what the arrow stands for, C6H12O6 is sugar plus oxygen. Now all of those things are happening here in this leaf. So we have water plus light is equal to chemical energy. The chloroplast, which is the organelle that's in the leaf, will trap the light energy. Water enters the leaf and they enter through stomata, which is also carbon dioxide entering the leaf through the stomata. And those are basically like pores. And in that process, then light's also in there. Sugar is produced in here, and so that's kind of what's being shown here. And then oxygen will leave. So our definition of photosynthesis is a biochemical pathway. So bio meaning life, and this is chemical because we're looking at chemistry that's happening here. So a chemical process of life that involves a complex series of chemical reactions. Now we're going to do kind of the simple version. It does get more complex, but we're kind of doing the simple version here. The key thing here is that if we did not have autotrophs, we could not have other life on Earth. So this process supports all life on Earth. Without autotrophs, we would have no other living things. All right, so if you go down, if you're doing the notes packet and you go down to the next section, Understanding Photosynthesis, we're going to look at 3 scientists that really impacted this study or this understanding of what photosynthesis is. The first is John van Helmont in the 17th century, and basically he wanted to know why a seed was able to grow to a large tree, such a tiny little seed, and then become a large tree. And so in his experiment, he concluded that plants need water to grow. And so that would be your discovery. He just found out water's necessary. Seems simple now, but this was a big step at that point. Our second scientist, about 100 years later, so 18th century, Joseph Priestley, and he set up an experiment with a candle. He discovered that the candle in a jar, if you put a candle in a jar, covered it, it would die out. But if you put a plant in there with the candle, that the candle would continue burning. So at this point, he realized that plants give off oxygen. I'm not sure if they had the term oxygen at that point, but he knew plants were giving off some type of gas, something that you couldn't see, that allowed for the candle to continue burning. And then to build off of that, around the same time, just probably a couple years after Joseph Priestley, John Ingenhouse found that the plant candle experiment only worked when the plant was exposed to sunlight. So in the conclusion, he concluded that light was necessary for plants to produce oxygen. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see that on the video. So light is necessary for the plant to produce oxygen. So these 3 guys really led us into the understanding of what photosynthesis is. Obviously, after microscope, discovery of the microscope, discovery of understanding, or maybe just understanding of more chemistry, there was a better understanding of the relationship between these things. So we knew that oxygen was being released. We know that plants need light and that they need water. But just understanding even more of the specifics came after these first 3 scientists. So next, if you are in the notes packet, we'll have the nature of light. I'm just going to look at the light spectrum or the electromagnetic spectrum. The electromagnetic spectrum is really wide. We go from things like FM radio all the way up to ultraviolet lights and X-rays and microwaves and things like that. The visible spectrum is really a tiny little speck on that electromagnetic spectrum. And basically in that we're looking at the rainbow colors. So it's separation of white light into the different wavelengths of light. Pigments, to be specific, those are molecules that absorb certain wavelengths. So they absorb wavelengths, but then they reflect or transmit others. And this is why you see a particular color. So if we're looking at trees, we generally see green leaves. But in the fall, we'll see the other pigments that come out. So the green that we see is the green that's being transmitted by the chlorophyll. It's absorbing all the other colors. In the fall, we start seeing all the other colors because the chlorophyll stops functioning. All right, we're going to go through the site of photosynthesis, and it occurs at the chloroplast. We talked about that last chapter, and this is a definition of the chloroplast again. You had this last chapter. It is an organelle, a mini little organelle that's inside the cell that contains chlorophyll, which is a pigment, and other pigments, and this is where photosynthesis occurs. So we want to see, what is the chloroplast made of? These are the 4 things the chloroplast is made of. A thylakoid, which is a disc structure that has photosynthetic pigments. So if you are looking at your picture, it's kind of hard to see on your copy, but it's just a little disc, kind of looks like a pancake. If we look at a stack of these thylakoids, they're called the granum. And if we look inside of one of these thylakoids, we will see the pigments, the chlorophyll. So the other term that's in here is stroma, and that's just the solution that's inside that kind of holds everything in place, kind of like cytoplasm is in the cell. The stroma is just a solution that's in there that kind of makes it fluid inside there. So when we take a look at chlorophyll specifically and then other pigments that are there, chlorophyll is the most common and important photosynthetic pigment in plants and algae. That's the one that allows you to see green pigment or green color in the plant, in the leaves. There are other pigments, and that's why we see other colors in the fall. So chlorophyll absorbs violet, blue, and red lights, and it will reflect or transmit green light, and that's why we see green color. There are other pigments. Chlorophyll A is the primary photosynthetic pigment, but there are accessory pigments like chlorophyll B and carotenoids. There's another one called xanthophyll, and later on we'll do a little reading of why leaves change color in the fall, and you'll see some of what these other pigments are. You don't really have to know those other pigments. Understanding that there are other ones other than just chlorophyll is fine. All right, so we're going to get into the first part of photosynthesis. So this is the beginning of photosynthesis, the light reaction. And in the light reaction, it obviously needs light. So it begins with the absorption of light, happens in the thylakoids, and this is what is produced. So I know these just look like chemicals, and that's what they are. You'll see them come up a couple different times, and really you just kind of need to memorize what you get out of the light reaction. So we get NADPH, we get ATP, and we get hydrogen. All of these are going to be used as it goes into part 2 of the photosynthesis cycle. And Calvin cycle right here, this is part 2. We'll get to that in our next set of notes. So these are the products. NADPH, it's just a carrier for energy. It will help to produce energy later. ATP, which is energy, and then hydrogen, which will be used as well later. The light reaction, you can see here, this is a thylakoid. You can see this should be a reminder to you. These are a membrane, a cell membrane right here. And then these are protein carriers. They help things get across the membrane. This one in particular is a ion carrier. It's got the H+. Sorry about that. So it's carrying the hydrogen across the membrane. You can see that happening here as well. And so basically, if you look at this picture, you can see there's a lot going on. We're not going to get as specific as this at this time. But you can see that there's a lot going on to produce energy. So if you are on the notes packet, go ahead and flip to the next page or the back of that page, and you'll see a chart where you can fill this in. So the light reaction, the reactants, that's what goes into the process. Water and sunlight. And then the products are what you get out. Hopefully you had that in a past science class. But if you haven't yet, reactants go into the chemical reaction, and products are what you get out. And so what we get out here is oxygen, ATP, NADPH, and hydrogen. These things right here are going to get used later when we talk about the Calvin cycle. So you can fill in that chart if by chance you are using the notes packet, and if you're not, you can kind of make your own chart there. And the last thing we're going to fill in is chemiosmosis. And chemiosmosis is the synthesis or making of ATP. This is our energy molecule. And so what happens here, there's a concentration gradient. So there's a difference of concentration across the thylakoid membrane. This should be reminder from chapter 5. Okay, and this thylakoid membrane is here. You can see that there. You can see this phospholipid membrane. And so the hydrogens are being pumped across the membrane, which happened, we talked about that in chapter 5. And what ends up happening here is we take a adenosine diphosphate and we turn it into adenosine triphosphate. And this is the goal, to get some ATP. Okay? We're going to end there for today, and we'll be moving on to part 2 of the photosynthesis reaction tomorrow.